Okay, good evening. Reminder, by Friday, please submit your clause analysis. I've received two so far. When you submit, I'm sorry the lights are such that you can't, I hope you can see it on the board. When you send the email to me in the subject line, would you mind to put LT 5456 clause analysis and then your name? Okay. Because otherwise it will be, mixed with a lot of other email. So this way I'll be able to quickly identify. So please remember to do that. Today, we're looking at the second week of verbal science, verbal art. There are handouts there for anyone who wasn't here last week and who is to get it. It's there. So if you want to get it, please get it. Verbal art. What we're saying with verbal art is that it serves as a vehicle for what Hassan calls second order semiosis. And what is semiosis? Meaning making, basically. A second order, not the literal, but the metaphorical. Turning the meanings of language into signs having a deeper meaning. And how is that accomplished? Basically, what your resources are for the verbal artist, all right, well, that would be the novelist, it would be the poet, are the resources that are available to us for language. Grammar, phonology, the semantics. But what turns it in then to a second order, deeper meaning? Is something that Hassan calls symbolic articulation. What does that mean? Well, it's novelized, so you somewhat don't see what is more obvious, and that is you are articulating symbols. It's the metaphorical. Now, how do you articulate the symbol? How do you articulate the metaphor? Through what Hassan calls foreground. And the picture that I've shown here, if you take a look at it, you see a lot of green trees and so forth. But what something stands out, and that is that little white line, which means it's a waterfall, right? So it stands out, it's foregrounded against a background. So how is the symbol, how is the metaphor articulated? It's articulated through foreground. And what is the purpose of foreground? It is to communicate a theme. Another word might be the motif. Hassan calls it a hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social being. A hypothesis. It is the writer's view about something about us that the writer's trying to communicate. And that aspect of our life, and the life is not just the human being, but the social man, because we are a part of the community. We are engaged with interaction with one another. If we wanted to put it another way, we could say what the writer is doing is artistically creating an automatization. The automatic would default. And what's the purpose? Purpose is to deoxydize. Creating a pattern in order to break the pattern. Well, what is the pattern? Pattern is some particular configuration of language. That pattern is our choices in phonology, lexicography, semantics. And what one has done is create a, remember the phrase, mobilizing, taking advantage of the habitual patterns of language use and turning them into something that has an inconsistent frequency. It is taking the way you use language, but putting it in with a frequency that we don't normally use, but which makes that pattern stand out, against which one is going to now foreground. I mentioned last time we looked at one poet. We're going to look at a few others today, and that is of the poet Edwin Tumplin. I especially like Edwin Tumplin because he's very mindful of the use of the language resources, very mindful of that. As he puts it, I'm looking at language as part of my life, trying to make my poems, putting language together. Technique is all about poetry in the making, chiseling of language, the rearranging of language, the sound, the rhythm, the tautness, layering. We looked last week at one of his poems, and this was the first poem that I had looked at, Thoughts and Dying. And if we were looking for this pattern that exists in the poem, it was a pattern of symmetry, balance, duality. And so what the poet was doing was taking a lot of words that are contrasting pairs. Major, minor, private, public, generous, mean, and so on. So you have a lot of these pairs. Pairs are symmetrical. They're opposites. And it's throughout the poem, powerful men undo themselves, good men bind themselves. The relaxed spirit of our evenings contrasted with these days of power, undo, bind, days, nights, evenings. So what the poet does is create what David Buck calls this existential pattern. It is the pattern that you see throughout the poem. This symmetry, this duality, these pairs, always comparing, balance. And how do you then foreground against that? When we talk about pairs of things, what is that? That's parataxis. That's symmetry. You join two things of equal rank. And that is throughout the poem. It's highly paratactic. So where will you foreground that? I illustrate with you. Remember, Edwin Tumplin talks about the tautness, the layering, and he layers them. You can see, I have seen powerful men undo themselves. Powerful men make two realities. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 layers in which he is building this sense of parataxis, pairs. And then he breaks it. He breaks it where he wants to draw your attention. But after a bit of duty that makes them fester with intentions, they play the major figure to old friends. It goes on in the next stanza as well. Again, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers. This is purposeful because he then wants to break that pattern with hypotaxis. So he's foregrounding, he's drawing your attention here because he's created this pattern that is so, it is the default. And against that, automatically deautomatizes it. When he does so, it's to get your attention. He says this, I believe that ultimately man makes and unmakes his destiny depending on which side of him prevails. And that was the whole idea that he was presenting here. We had two sides. Which side prevails? The godly side or the ungodly side? The duality apparent in this text personality. Halliday, when he's talking about stylistics, and he's talking about a text, he talks about a text personality. And in this text personality, it reflects the poet's feelings about his friend's personality. He judged his friend. It's a poem of judgment. His friend is two-faced. His friend is now hypocritical. And what has done that, and what has made that happen, is the friends coming into power. The poet's frustration, disdain for what power has done to their relationship, it's made very much evident in the foregrounding of elements that disturb this otherwise balanced state. Okay, the next poem. I call it Tumbu's David. He called it David. You know who is David? David is someone in the Bible, right? What was interesting to me was that this poem is basically a retelling of a Bible story. I can go to the Bible and look up in Samuel, and I find this story about David. What was the story? David was anointed to be king. What happened to the previous king? The previous king was King Saul. He also had been appointed by God, but King Saul had sort of turned against God and sort of gone on his own way. And so God was intending to basically replace him. So he anointed David, this shepherd boy, to become king. Now, what do you imagine was Saul's feelings toward David? He hated him, and he was trying his best to kill him. Even though, as it turns out, David was his son-in-law. David married Saul's daughter. And Saul was intent to kill him. Now, throughout then this story about David, at this point in his life, he is wandering the wilderness. He's trying to stay away, keep away from Saul. He has this band of followers that continue to be with him. And Saul is chasing him with his army. No. Don't you begin to wonder right now why this poem? Why this story? Why this story is one that he said for Jonathan Webster. I was very curious why, of all the stories in the Bible, there are some really nice ones, all right, to write a poem about. Instead, he writes a poem about this story about a king who is trying to kill his anointed successor. Two things happened. Two events occurred. This is telling one of those events. David sneaks into the camp where Saul is sleeping. He goes up to Saul and he has the chance to take Saul's spear. And what could he have done? Killed Saul. He put an end to all this chasing and him being exiled into the wilderness. He killed Saul, but he refused to do so. Okay, so you have the text. Let's listen as he reads the poem.
Shepherd Step astutely tempered by the blunt history of his fate, David and volunteer are beside sought and found. For the second terrible time, their king. Saul's dedicated jealous anger still fermented, still heaved and proud, but David's deeply rooted faith chose to see the Lord's anointing. Not the royal discontent, the turbulent hunter of his life, who gave without intent, point, and precision to his hardy band, to their fugitive wanderings among hill and cave and longish and Gilead nights. Thus delivered, Saul lay fragile, exhausted, sealed in quiet, his spear neatly pushed into the ground by his bolster. So the grievous, great flawed instrument, restless victim of disobedience, rampaging willfulness, who so needed music, love, courage, monumental anger, adrenaline for tribal nation, who was moved by majesty, pride, quick remorse, remembered the quarrelsome word of Samuel, that thought, that uses of a judge, third prophet. Let me smite him, I pray thee. The Lord himself will strike. And David, taking the mighty spear, whose sharp whistle had shaved the air before, just missing him as he sat upon his side. And the cruise of water, life, leaving the camp, the chance to cure so simply, the exile in the uncertain bitter south, they walked between trenches of enemies, divinely tranquilized. So ensued some necessary prophecies to fill their days, sparing some metaphors for us. And they get them away, and no man saw it. Darting nimbly as they climbed, held their breath, checked the drift of stars, the needling angle of the wind, as it shifted across gullies, pushing patches of mist up the slopes. Pain and joy rippled in their hearts, kept from discovering certain death, but the Lord, whose other hand dispensed the dew of sleep on Saul's army. They gained the distant high space of a neighboring hill, where sad David called down to Abner, Saul's bravest of the brave. Ye are worthy to die. Ye have not kept your master. And spoke to Saul, and then
All right, now, how am I going to approach this poem? I've just analyzed Thoughts and Die. I saw how he used pairs. Is he going to use the same strategy here? With Shepherd's stealth astutely tempered by the blunt history of his fate, David and volunteer Abishai sought and found for the second terrible time their king asleep. I do notice that we have David and volunteer Abishai. Abishai was the guy who accompanied David when he snuck into the camp. We have two verbs, sought and found. So we have these two pairs, and these two pairs are they're balanced because on the one hand, you have this pre-modification of David, and you have this post-modification of found. It seems quite symmetrical, right? Balanced. But there was another thing that seemed to be going on in this poem, and that was that there were a lot of times when he repeated things in threes. Saul's dedicated, jealous, anger. Anger is pre-modified by Saul's, dedicated, jealous. 3, adjectival forms. 1 is a possessive. Still fermented, still heaved, and called. 2 that are alike, still fermented, still heaved. And 1 simple verb, called. 2 that are alike, 1 that's different. 2 that are alike, 1 that's different. And this is what I kept encountering. As I went through the poem, I kept noticing there were things in threes. 2 that would be alike, and 1 that would be different. And this almost the mirror image of the other. You might say was even like overlaid. And when you overlay that 2 that are alike and 1 different, this sort of triangular shape, and you overlay them, what do you get? The Star of David. In other words, there is really a visual metaphor that the poet is creating out of the language. But let's keep going. Let's keep looking. Again, but David's deeply rooted faith chose to see the Lord's anointed, not the royal discontent, not the turbulent hunter of his life. Among hill and cave, 2 sort of places and time, longish En Gedi nights. And same kind of pattern emerges. Who gave without intent, point, and precision to his hardy band, to their fugitive wanderings, pairs, pairing, and again preceded by a pre-modification and followed by a post-modification. You have this sense of balance, but the balance involves a pair and 1 odd one. When Saul is described, he's described as grievous, great, that's alliteration, and then flawed instrument. Deed in music, loved courage, the same grammatical pattern. Monumental anger, majesty, pride, 2 nouns, quick remorse. 2 that are alike, 1 that is different. So this is throughout the poem. Even when he talks about those that make up the poem, the characters that are a part of the poem, you have David and the guy who's accompanying him, Abishai. You have Saul and the guard that is supposed to look after him. And you have the Lord and his prophet, Samuel. Again, notice this. And again, when you're looking at this layering, what do you notice here? I'll read it. And they left, taking the mighty spear, whose sharp whistle had shaved the air before, just missing him as he sat composing songs. Left, taking, had shaved, past, ing, missing, past, sat, ing verb. 1 after another, 3. Arguably, this is simple past. This is past perfect, had shape. 1 is different. He always has things in threes, and 2 that'll be alike, and 1 that'll be different. But notice something. If you have all these things in threes, if that's the automatic, what can break? What can break it is a simple parataxis. It is the opposite of what he did in God's 10 Time. There was parataxis broken by hypotaxis. Here it is hypotaxis, clause complexity all over the place, always things in threes, 1 different, and then a pair. The cruse of water. Water. The living water. Twice he does this. Pain and joy because in their hearts. The cruse of water, life, pain and joy. I'm beginning to see the metaphor, and I'm beginning to see when he talks about some metaphors for us, I'm beginning to see the metaphor for me. Because out of this, I see this life, this pain and joy. Again, we have another darting nimbly as they climb. Now, you don't see this, right? When you're reading it. I didn't see it when I first read it. Again, it just seemed like telling a story in a nice poetic way. But really, there is such purpose, there is such design, there is such craft to the art. Darting, pushing, held, checked, the drifting of stars, the needling angle of the wind. A pair preceded by an ing verb, a pair followed by an ing verb. And again, that almost near effect. Kept from discovery, certain death, a pair. Abner, Saul's bravest of the brave. And again, this is followed by a post modifier. This is with a pre-modifier. But there's another element to this. David is the one who is credited with writing what book of the Bible, you know? The Psalms. The Psalms are David's songs. David was a musician. Not only was he this general, he was a musician. He was a poet. And he wrote the Psalms. There's a particular sort of design in the Psalms, and it's called a chiastic pattern. And that chiastic pattern you see here, kept, certain death, die, kept. In other words, it is sort of like crisscross. From the Psalms, we see this, for example, the heavens declare the glory of God. The heavens. What are the heavens? The heavens are what you see at nighttime. It is beyond the sky, okay? The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they reveal knowledge. In other words, what you begin with here and follow, what you follow here with begins here, follows here. It's an X. And that's why it's the chi, it's the Greek letter for the X that you see. This is a chiastic structure. But we see it in Tungu's poem as well. But these were the two lines that struck me. Some prophecy, some metaphors for us. Heard and was spoken, saw, again, the same thing. What was the metaphor for me? What was that visual metaphor? Do you remember it? The shield. I said a shield. Why do I say a shield? We're talking about the Star of David. According to legend is that the shield that David held was in the shape of what we now know as the Star of David. What was this story about? It was about that God protected David. David was looked after by God. He was protected by God. This I took as the metaphor for me. This was the meaning for me. Yes, in life, you have pain and you have joy, but you are protected. God watches over you. He shields you. And this was the meaning of the poem.